Hello, my name is Angela Cochran. I'm the Managing Director and Publisher at the American Society of Civil Engineers and the past president of the Society for Scholarly Publishing. During a time of great change and uncertainty, SSP's mission remains to advance the professional development of our community through education, collaboration, and certainly networking. To that end, we're very excited to bring you the first presentation of SSP's Professional Development Series, part of the new on-demand video library launching this month. The Professional Development Series will feature a number of presentations on current issues in scholarly communications, such as the growing role of preprints in publishing, new open access business models, trends in international research, and fostering more inclusive workplace cultures. We thank you for joining us as we continue to find new ways to bring members of our community together, and we hope to see you in future sessions. Today, we're going to talk about the impact that COVID-19 has had on scholarly communications. I'm joined today by my colleague, Lisa Hinchliffe, who is going to talk about some of the challenges from the library community. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges from the publishing side of things. So Lisa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Angela. It's great to be with everyone here today. So as Angela said, I'm Lisa Janicki Hinchliffe. I'm a librarian at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. My role there is that I oversee our educational programs, but I also am very engaged sort of within the larger professional community of academic librarians and have the honor of serving on the board for the Society for Scholarly Publishing. So it'll be interesting to have this conversation, I think, Angela, across the table today, or our metaphorical virtual table, about the ways we're seeing different things happening on the library side and the publisher side.
Yeah, I thought maybe it would be nice to look back a little bit before we think about looking forward on what we think is going to happen in the next 6 or 12 or even maybe 3 months. But kind of thinking back to when this started, which feels like a year and a half ago, but was in reality maybe 13 or 14 weeks ago. Were universities, do you think, equipped for this kind of disruption?
So I think it's a good question, right? On like, what does it even mean to be equipped for this kind of disruption? I think not surprisingly, we see that libraries and universities were prepared in a variety of different degrees to handle the situation that they were faced with. And part of it is that not every part of the country faced the challenge at the same time. And so we know, for example, that schools in New York City in particular, we're facing some of the challenges sort of about a week before. So not a huge amount of pre-warning, but a week before, if we will say that it kind of spread across the nation. I think that many academic institutions were fortunate either if they were on the quarter system, that they were actually coming quite near to the end of a quarter, and so they just sort of had to get to the end of a couple weeks. For those schools that were more on the semester, for many of them, this fell, like the decision period of sort of what to do and how to pivot fell relatively convenient to spring break. And so many had spring break as a time period in which to pivot their institution. If I can say about academic libraries specifically, I think as organizations, institutions, or subunits of our campus, in many ways we were better prepared to be in an all digital mode than some other units on campus because we have over the years built up such robust digital services. As I sort of like to quip, unfortunately, maybe it's becoming a cliche now, but I often said that all library users are remote and some of them come in some of the time. So I think that's really different than people who were in an all in person and suddenly went to an all remote. Libraries, with especially the digital collections, so much of our service to our patrons was already remote. And so, yes, we had to pivot to being only remote, but that was pivoting to then focus on an area that our activities as opposed to have to spin up an area that we weren't working on. So there's really quite a big success story of the historic investment that libraries have made in building their digital profile. Of course, that comes in partnership with publishers who, I think also are interested in digital distribution, but also responded to libraries that were beginning to ask that in, the 1980s, 1990s. And then, of course, we also have things, preservation projects or digitization projects like the HathiTrust that have also sort of served as a backbone or a fallback for some of the things that we would not have been able to do. I mean, you would just not have millions of books that are out of copyright digitized if that hadn't been a decades of investment in that. So the story here for libraries is actually one of quite a lot of success, which is not to say, however, that we haven't had our challenges.
Yeah, so I mean, I would think that there's an access issue. How do you make sure that the collections remain accessible to people? Were there things that surprised you or the community in general about, you have this rich digital collection. There's a certain amount of remote access that's happening on campus or slightly off campus. Were there things that that didn't work as you might have thought?
I don't know if I would say it didn't work as I might have thought, so much as, if somebody had asked me 2 weeks before, predict what would happen if the entire campus was now remote accessing the library and no one had IP-based authentication, I would have told you this, predicted the exact problems and challenges that we face. So I don't think they were a surprise in the sense that, like, who would have ever thought people have difficulty accessing content from off campus?
Mm-hmm.
People have difficulty accessing content from off campus all the time. We just didn't have that being the only option for people. And of course, IP authentication is one of the most seamless approaches to authenticating for content, and that became essentially not happening in so many cases as people were not able to be within the IP authenticated range. So I don't think that's a surprise. It, of course, was a challenge in that we are very used to in libraries helping people troubleshoot this kind of remote access. We do it every day. We've been doing it every day of my entire career, 20 some years. We just weren't doing it for everyone. And now we're doing it for everyone. And I also think that one of the things we saw is that some of these infrastructures that had been set up over time, alternative mechanisms, VPNs, proxy servers, even account-based creation on publisher platforms, pairing devices. I mean, as well as I do that libraries and publishers have invested in an immense array of approaches to this challenge of getting entitled users to content. Many of those were operating sort of just fine under the load they were under. But when that load spiked, if you will, as everyone went remote, some of those infrastructures weren't able to handle that increased demand. So I know, for example, our own campus, when you log into the VPN right now, it pops up a little message that says, I won't get the wording correct, but essentially it says, hey, do you really need to be using the VPN? Because they're trying, the VPN will get overwhelmed, which then means no one can use the VPN. So they're trying to say, like, hey, if you don't need to be using the VPN for the applications that you need right now, consider not.
Yeah.
Because there are some applications that can only be used through the VPN, not from the library, but elsewhere on campus. So I just think it's sort of shown us, we may have had really robust infrastructures previously, but they weren't robust at the scale that they suddenly were being asked to perform under.
Yeah. And I think we saw that too, and on the publisher side, that we expected that people would be able to access through VPNs or other authentication methods, and found even my own building, we don't have we have a VPN that doesn't use static IPs, so it's just grabbing random IPs. So we didn't even internally have access to our own content platform. And that was something that we saw from a lot of our corporate customers. Were under the same circumstances. So it was trying to figure out, okay, how do you troubleshoot that? And government government offices that subscribe to the content, you know, we can't really tell them, well, we can, go check out this Open Athens website. And they're like, yeah, that's great. There's a $700 application fee or whatever it is. You know, we're not going to do that, and trying to come up with new ways for access. But even globally, learning more for us, learning more about parts of the world that don't have federated access to even join. And working out, you know, with countries like China that does have a federation, but it wasn't connected with our platform, and how to make sure working with other publishers in tandem to say, are you guys having this trouble on the same platforms, and making sure that the platform vendors are doing what needs to happen to set up access. So from our perspective, I think we were a little bit surprised, and then I think, well, we probably shouldn't have been surprised, but I think we were a little taken aback in that there's a lot of opportunities to get more libraries sort of hooked up onto Shibboleth or other federated access.
Yeah, and I mean, the federated access is a great example of a, you know, an authentication mechanism that could scale further than it has, but you know, how we have these conversations where we anticipate the future is something that I personally actually have been working on. I think, as you know, through more of the Charleston conference with the ATG Trend Spotting Initiative. And I will say we didn't have a trend where we predict a pandemic, so I'm not claiming any sort of, but we have some other trends in there that really have pointed to the fact that, you know, increased remote, distributed sorts of things, and how you then take some of these more abstract trends or sort of larger social trends and turn them into operational strategy, business strategy. And particularly, we know from some of the work with Seamless Access, for example, the project Seamless Access, you know, we've got publishers who are set up able to use Shibboleth, but then the libraries that they are serving haven't activated it or have been unable to activate it on their campuses. We also have campuses that have Shibboleth and libraries that are implementing it, but then not all publishers have done it. So all of these things are often, when we come to especially the academic environment, you know, it's both parties sort of have to work together, and then it becomes even harder with the federated access, because on top of the library, we also have to have campus IT in most cases involved, because the Shibboleth is a campus service, unlike the proxy server, which is a library service in most cases that is library controlled. Not to say that campus IT isn't involved, but there's just a locus of control issue that I think has made a difference there. So I think that this has really pointed to some areas that, you know, maybe we weren't paying as systematic attention to before. I don't feel that any effort we've made during the pandemic in this area is going to be lost, because I think we're going to really see that this sort of remote access to resources is going to continue. I mean, first of all, it's going to continue for quite some time, as we've been talking about, because we are going to be in social distancing and, you know, work shifts and all sorts of things. But I don't think anyone will be harmed by the fact that we have now a more robust infrastructure, as well as awareness of which parts of those infrastructures work really well in certain use cases, and which sort of aren't up to the demand that could be placed upon them. Yep. I think the other thing that we've seen, and I guess I'd be curious with you as well, is you know, libraries also historically have built up a digital help desk, if you will. We call it the reference desk in the library world. But so some libraries did not have a very robust online service. They, of course, answered the phone and did emails. But we've seen, I think, an increase in the number of libraries that have implemented some sort of online chat service. And then those libraries that did have online chat service, you know, we've been seeing an immense proportion of our things be even more so, how do I get access to? How do I get access to? Including to some print materials. But I'm curious if your help desk also saw, you know, this increase, this shift to questions about access rather than questions about, say, submitting manuscripts or some of those other researcher activities that we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah, not really. I mean, I think that all of the general workflow stuff, so submission systems and all of the all the content being on platforms, it's been fairly smooth. Where uh, um, we have a couple of different platforms besides just our big ASC library with lots of journals and book content, and they might be for one product. So we have a platform for one of our standards, and those tended to have a little bit more disruption. But again, a lot of that has to do with a company purchased a subscription and they're IP authenticated. And so the other thing that was sort of at the beginning that we had to field around standards is that our biggest standard, engineers still really like having print copies, and so we count on companies will purchase like 5 or 6 print copies of the standard, and they share it, in the office, and then all of a sudden we were getting calls of, we don't have access to the standard, but we're still expected to work. We were able to use that as an opportunity to say, well, how about a trial subscription to our online platform? So we're hoping that turns things around. But it took us a while to kind of get that set up because, again, it's not always easy. So for some products that still have a print component to it that's useful, we've had to try to provide for those print purchasers the online version for this time while they're not in their office.
Yeah.
So,
I was
um,
gonna say, I mean, and we've also seen, we obviously have a lot of different disciplines. We're at a research university than as a science society, but, so certainly libraries are still seeing some demand for some materials that we only have in print. The other thing that we haven't talked about quite as much is about classroom use. And of course, in addition to faculty pivoting their classes online, we also had the challenge, right, that maybe they were planning to, maybe it was on course reserve in the library, or maybe students were just going to come in and look at a reference book like a standard.
yeah.
So many libraries did some sort of rapid digitization, especially for course materials. And I think we really can, we really appreciate that a lot of publishers also were quite sort of like, do what you need to do.
Yeah.
We understand that we're in a semester that is just not what anyone expected. So like for spring 2020, there's kind of a like, everyone's just saying, do what you need to do. Of course, that's probably going to, the expectations will change as we now move into more planned
Yeah.
remote sort of instruction. But, so libraries are also moving, if they stopped any sort of materials delivery, and many did, although not all,
Mhm.
are now moving to some sort of curbside
Yeah.
or delivery service. So I know my own library has sort of got a procedure set up, um, particularly for some of our humanists. Our print collection is quite important to their scholarship, especially over the summer.
Yeah.
And so there's a process by which you can make a request and then you'll be assigned a time and can come
Mhm.
to a very designated place with a set protocol. It's a lot like picking up your groceries from Target or what have you, right? Of like the sort of protocols that we put in place. But I think, the American Library Association actually released a study, a survey-based study earlier, just a couple weeks ago, where they looked at, what are different libraries doing, and we're definitely seeing, curbside pickup kind of service is going to be part of the portfolio of what we see from our academic libraries this fall. That will continue to challenge, of course, those materials that are more reference books, like the
Mhm.
standards you talked about. But I think this is also just going to cause this sort of continued shift to digital. And for me personally, one of the things I'm interested in kind of watching is the degree to which this might actually flip the default that
Mhm.
um, not, so there's been some panning, right, where people are like, well, libraries will still, of course, like you shouldn't abandon print. And I'm not talking about abandoning print. I'm talking about the default to digital.
Yeah.
So right now, if somebody orders a book, like ask the library to buy a book, I think the default is we would buy it in print unless we sort of, and I say we generally here, I don't mean
Mhm.
my particular library. I think that this might shift some thinking that the default will now be digital, and you better like say specifically if what you meant is you wanted it in print. And I
Right.
think the journals, historically have already been through that transition
Yes.
in most cases.
Yeah.
But books have not. And so it'll be interesting to see if, not to say we wouldn't buy print, but the assumed purchase, which is the assumed default purchase. I think it's possible this is going to cause that to at least default to digital, or at least default to you have to be specific. Like we're not going to assume one way or the other.
This is a good segue to think about, we've sort of looked at what's happened over the last few months or few weeks, but going forward, there is a lot of inconsistency around book content and how it's available digital. Libraries are purchasing ebooks in different ways. Some of them are
Publishers are selling them in different ways.
selling them in different ways. There's, some have restrictive DRM and some don't have DRM. And, my sense has been that it's harder to get digital book content sometimes into the library system. And that there's still, it seems, from what I've heard kind of anecdotally from the library community, that there's still a wide range of how publishers are handling ebooks, and that maybe if the going forward is greater emphasis on digital, we really need to get our books to the same sort of level that we've got our journals to.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, I appreciate the challenge that digital publishing has been for the publishing world. But I'll just say for myself as a faculty member, and here I'm saying when I'm in my teaching role, not in my personal research role, I'll go through an awful lot as a personal research role, but even then I certainly get frustrated. But when I'm trying to teach a class, and the class I teach is library service evaluation, there were a number of book chapters that I would have loved to assign to my students, but they weren't cases where the whole book was relevant. I mean, it would not be an assigned text. For certain platforms, and I'll just not say names here in the interest of sort of good spirits, for certain platforms, I could very easily assign one chapter. For other platforms, even assigning a chapter meant the student had to create an account on that platform. But then once they were looking at the chapter, no one else in the class could look at the chapter at the same time, including me as the instructor. So then if they ask me a question about it, I can't look at it. And it's got restricted printing, so I can't even, like this just becomes too hard.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think ultimately there has to be this question, which is, it's one of the 5 laws of librarianship, Raghunathan's 5 laws, which is, basically like books are for use. Every book their reader, every reader their book. And, at some point the user experience is so poor that one really can't use it
Yeah.
for certain cases. And so I do understand there's concerns about piracy, there's concerns about unauthorized access, all of these things, but I really think we have to figure out a better user experience for this content, because in so many cases, a number of libraries have said to me, if it's on that platform, again, I won't name names, I consider it to not be available digitally. Like
Yeah.
it's because it's so not usable. So
Yeah.
it's something that publishers really, I think, have to think seriously about, because especially if there's a shift to preferring digital, that then becomes a competitive problem as well.
Exactly. That's what I'm thinking. And it's an opportunity. There's publishers that publish a lot of journals, we focus a lot of attention on journals, and then you have books.
Mhm.
and and so we need to, I think that what we may learn from this is, we need to be paying that same kind of attention. And even the platforms that we have journals on, which are designed to make things easier, believe it or not. I mean, it's different than like a corporate website. There are things about it that make it, this is what I have to tell my corporate IT team all the time. Like, our content for libraries is different than, a regular website. But even on our publishing platforms, sometimes getting book content onto there is like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. Like, it doesn't always match, and things have gotten better, but we hear things too from libraries that they don't want to buy books one by one from us, and because it's hard to then include it into the collections.
Mhm.
So there's a preference for perhaps getting the books through a standard platform that's made for delivering ebooks, but then if that's not providing the service that libraries and students need, um,
Mhm.
then that's something that I think publishers, like, it's in that system, and if libraries need it, they can get it from that system. But maybe we're not doing a good enough job getting the feedback on what the user experience is on that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the other thing is, we kind of said at the beginning, we've been through this journey with journal content. Certainly things could continue to improve for journal content, but I think there's both better standards as well as just sort of a general sense that, okay, this is how this works. And so one can predict one's user experience on a journal platform to a certain degree. I'm going to be able to do these sorts of things. It's going to work in this sorts of ways, right? There's kind of almost like a heuristical knowledge now of a journal platform. If I go to yours, if I go to someone else's, I'm going to get that experience. I have no heuristical sense of what an ebook platform's experience is going to be.
Yeah.
I really can't predict. And the other thing we haven't raised here is I think also within the book market, there's quite a bit of difference between books that are edited monographs, chapters, where the chapters in many ways stand alone,
Mhm.
and full length monographs, that chapter one is, works itself all the way through chapter 10, and there's like a coherence and an integration. So that also strikes me as that we're in many ways, the edited monograph is able to be treated like a single issue journal.
Right.
That is not the case when you come to, monograph length, I'd say single author, but they can be co-authored. But the point is that the whole thing is authored by whoever the thing is authored by.
Yep.
And those are particularly challenging on some of these platforms where you can only print so many pages, which
Mhm.
is fine if what you want is chapter 2 because it's standalone chapter 2, but it's highly problematic if you're trying to deal with a 300-page monograph then. So
Yes.
lots
Imagine.
lots of complications there. I mean, the
Yep.
other thing we haven't really talked about is the fact too is that there's now multimedia content. And so the good news is for the most part that was never in an analog format. So we're not having to deal with people's expectations, but we're still definitely struggling to get a good user experience when there is multimedia content that goes with text.
Yes, for sure. Much
So
work to do there.
less due to the pandemic than just this other thing. So
Yeah. I think we're all pretty much expecting that there. Well, let me back up a sec. So some of the journals, some of the publishers, particularly in the medical space, have really had to shift how their peer review process is working, how their production processes are working to try to speed things through. There's been a lot of resources that have been made, freely available for a certain period of time. Peer review has gotten faster for some of these publications. At some point, there needs to be an off ramp, right? So, what do you think? Where do you think we're going to kind of land with stuff sliding back to normal. What's that going to look like?
So I'm not a person who actually thinks there's a back to normal.
Yeah,
You know?
I tend to not believe that
Um,
either,
yeah, I mean, the other thing we haven't talked about yet, but I know is on your mind, so I'll bring it up too
but okay.
here, is that higher education, academic libraries, research libraries, all of the governmental agent, these are all going to be under tremendous financial pressure.
Mhm.
Some research that has been reported out are libraries talking about 10 to 20% cuts. Unclear if those are just in collections across the entire budget. Those are significant cuts.
Mhm.
And so I expect I mean, it's without a doubt, some publishers are going to feel the brunt of that. So I think that's the other question, right? Is that, you know, so there's going to be less money to spend. So libraries will need to decide where they're going to spend it, but there will also be less revenue. And so publishers will have to decide where they're going to spend, and
Yes.
so one of the things that will also just come out in this, I think, is what does the budget cut? And that is both on the publisher side and the library side. So, I think we can predict that libraries are going to cut resources that are used less. I mean, they're going to cut resources in areas where the campus cuts programs. We
Yeah.
know, for example, the University of Alaska just eliminated essentially all their geology, sociology, almost across the system. So, I mean, of course, those libraries will still buy something in sociology, but they're not going to be supporting researchers in these areas now.
Mhm.
So, regardless of how one feels about that decision,
Right.
financially, that's the way it's going to
Yeah.
play
Yeah.
out. We also know that there is some predictions of some pretty dire contraction of just the number of institutions of higher education we will see in the United States. Um, Now, there's predictions that I think sound very catastrophic. I don't tend to quite that, but I mean, we were already seeing small institutions closing.
Right.
So we're going to see that continue as well. So the customer base gets smaller as well. So I think we're going to see, some contraction. And the question is, how is that contraction played out? So, I'm also expecting to see cuts in print, right? Both on the publisher side and the library side. Library saying we're going to cut the print, and then publishers saying, yeah, we're not printing anymore.
Yeah.
Including, we saw the disruption, like literal physical material disruption of print publications this spring.
Sure. Yes. A lot of publishers that just stopped print for a number of months.
Mhm.
And, you know, some of them will decide not to continue with print. My guess is they'll say, okay, we've gone for 5 months without doing print and everybody was happy and everyone survived. So we're going to do that going forward. But um, yeah, the physical limitations of print, and then I think you're right. Looking at where is the funding going to go? I mean, what the universities, what programs they fund, and what people choose to, what fields people choose to go into goes by the way of the research money as well. And so, where do we think the research funding is going to go, into what subject areas, what's most profitable for the universities because they have to make these decisions now, and then what programs, as far as the publishing content, where that's going to come from. I know that, we've been watching certainly the news of big publishers and small publishers pledging that, subscription prices are frozen for 2021. That is for some of us smaller society publishers, that's, you know, unheard of. That's
Mhm.
like, oh my goodness, how can we do that? There's a certain amount of attrition every year through consolidation. You mentioned universities potentially closing, but we also see losses when there's consolidation
Mhm.
of universities, which has tended to happen more overseas than it has happened in the U.S. But um, those real kind of challenges around the publication content, and then seeing, are we still going to see the same amount of output? Are we still going to see the same amount of papers coming to us? And I don't know that we really know that yet. I mean, medical journals are slammed with,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so they're not seeing an end anytime soon. But as funding shifts in 2021, I think we'll have a better picture.
So, I mean, I think though, even those, that are slammed, as you said, so that's increased cost for
Yep.
them as well, right? So I think the other sort of unknown here is, as we know, there's also been this whole open access thing happening alongside. And, when we say the impact of COVID on scholarly communication, scholarly publishing, that does need to include the impact on open access. And so obviously, open access publishing that's happening under transformative agreements that were in place prior to the pandemic, that'll continue, but that also, those large transformative deals lock up money, right? And so now those are sort of, those agreements are, if you will, protected from the cuts, which means your cuts have to come from other places. So any of these big deals, whether it's a big subscription deal or a transformative agreement, pure publish agreement, whatever it is, you've committed a certain amount of money, and those commitments, given they are multi-year, has an impact. But so it'll be interesting to see what happens with some of this open access funding. Sometimes this funding was additional funding that was provided to support OA publishing. Will that be protected by universities because they see the value of their scholarship being open? I think we see a certain number of institutions that have decided that there's competitive advantage in their scholarship being open. Will they continue to see that competitive advantage worth that investment?
Well,
So
sure. And in that dynamic, we've sort of, universities have sort of been split into two camps, the read heavy and the publish heavy. Some are both. But, when we talk about the transformative agreements and who is going to be disproportionately paying, it's the publish. And if they're seeing major shifts in their budgets, that certainly calls the whole thing into question.
yeah, I mean, I just think across the whole thing, we just don't quite know whether it's individual APC payments. We certainly also see libraries canceling their big deals. Where they unbundle and they say, no, we don't actually want all you have. We're going to choose a la carte.
Yeah.
And the amount of journals they keep out of a big deal can vary quite radically.
Sure.
We also see actual attempts to actually make the big deal even bigger, which is the transformative agreements, right? Where you've got now publishing and reading together. So how this impacts that momentum is just an unknown question. It seems likely to me that in most cases, though, it will push more towards unbundling.
Yeah.
Because the unbundling gives you financial flexibility. And it, as we see in some of the reports, it can be a significant savings.
Mm-hmm.
And we will also apparently, I suspect we will continue to see certain institutions walk wholly away from certain publishers. And in cases like that, the question becomes, where do those monies get invested? And if they do get invested, is there any chance that they ever get reinvested in that original publisher? So there's a lot of unknowns about what happens in this time of financial conflation, if you will, or restriction, as opposed to if people had new monies, where were they spending it? It's a very
Right.
different question than where do you cut when you have to cut. So it's easy to see a publisher also investing in sort of new technologies for their platforms, automatic indexing, a lot of the things that happen behind the scenes when there is profit coming in, right? And you're saying, how can we invest this strategically? Yep. Such a different question than, we lost X% of our subscriber base or our transformative agreement, whatever base, and
Yep.
now we have to take money out. So where do we cut?
Yeah.
Even where can you cut, right? So like whatever your expenses are for managing the peer review process, you probably need to manage the peer review process still.
That's
So,
right.
you know,
There are
certain
certain
things,
fixed costs that,
yeah,
right.
right. So there's just going to be a lot, I think, of opportunity to think really carefully and to really examine the value that's added in any particular workflow of any particular piece of technology or process or how things are re-engineered.
You know, I'm thinking about years of discussing what the new models will be and how we will pay for and who will pay for, and it always comes back to there's plenty of money in the system. It just may shift around, but it's striking me that come next year there may not be plenty of money in the system. So all the best plans are sort of, you know, in flux with that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
It's
I would
it's
agree.
interesting. Yeah. So I think what we should do is we should plan on coming back on June, you know, around June of 2021 and see where take a 1 year look back and see if we have any answers to these questions. I'm
That
hoping by
sounds great.
things will possibly settle down. But I really appreciate you joining me today, Lisa, for our inaugural online event and for talking about this with me.
Well, thank you so much, Angela, for inviting me. It's always great to sit and talk with you.
Great.
Great.
Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.